George steered his car towards home after another successful day at 46, his business's headquarters. Everything seemed to have finally fallen into place, just as he had always hoped. The company he'd poured his heart and soul into was flourishing, and the profits were at an all-time high. At home, his wife of over 15 years, Nicole, was pregnant with their second child. A surprise that somehow made their life together feel even more complete. Their eldest daughter, Clara, was preparing to leave for college, marking a new chapter for the family. As George drove, the soft hum of the engine mingled with the calmness of his thoughts, a rare luxury he hadn't experienced in years. For a fleeting moment, everything felt perfect. He'd worked tirelessly for this life, securing his family's future. And now, for the first time, he was truly enjoying the rewards. But, as always, life had a way of shifting unexpectedly, without a hint of warning. As he neared a bend in the road, George gently tapped the brakes, but the car didn't slow down. Perplexed, he pressed harder, only to feel the pedal give way under his foot. His heart skipped a beat as panic set in. The brakes had failed. With the car picking up speed on a slight downhill, he gripped the steering wheel tighter and scanned the road ahead. The traffic moved smoothly, but the sharp turn ahead was coming up fast. His mind scrambled for a solution. He shifted the car into a lower gear, trying to slow it down manually. It worked just a little, but not nearly enough. That's when he noticed the gravel shoulder to the side and swerved toward it, his hands shaking as he fought to regain control. The car crashed into an iron fence, jerking violently before coming to a stop. George sat there, frozen, the sound of his racing heart drowning out everything else. The car was totaled, but somehow he was unharmed. For what felt like an eternity, he just gripped the wheel, his mind flashing to his family. Nicole, Clara, and the unborn child. The thought of losing any of them or them losing him sent a shiver down his spine. He shuddered, then forced himself to focus. The car needed to be towed to a shop. At the mechanic's, a weathered man with oil-smeared hands inspected the car while George paced anxiously. When the mechanic finally emerged, his face was grim. "Someone tampered with your brake lines," he said bluntly. George froze, his heart sinking. "What do you mean, tampered with?" he asked, disbelief clear in his voice. "This isn't just regular wear and tear," the mechanic said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Somebody deliberately messed with it." A wave of nausea hit George. Who would do this? He tried to shake off the thought, hoping the mechanic was wrong or there was some innocent explanation. But he couldn't dwell on it now. He left the shop and drove home, his mind swirling. When he pulled into their large suburban home, Nicole greeted him at the door, her smile as bright as ever, though there was something subtly off about her tonight. She brushed a strand of hair from her face and asked, "You're late. Everything okay?" "Car trouble," George said casually, opting not to go into detail. "It's in the shop now." Nicole nodded, but her smile faltered for just a second. From the living room, her sister Louise was lounging on the couch, absorbed in her phone. When George entered, she looked up briefly, offering a thin, uninterested smile before returning to her screen. George couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about her, her posture stiff and tense. "Maybe you should just buy a new car," Louise chimed in, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Or, actually take care of the one you've got." George couldn't help but smirk, choosing not to rise to the bait. Louise's sharp tongue was nothing new, and their relationship had been strained ever since that huge argument years ago. But her words stuck with him, gnawing at him more than he cared to admit. Combined with Nicole's distracted behavior, George couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. That night, as he lay next to Nicole, the mechanic's chilling words echoed in his mind. Tampered with. Nicole's strange reaction and Louise's thinly veiled hostility only fueled his growing unease. He tried to convince himself he was reading too much into it, that he was just overthinking things. After all, Nicole was pregnant. Surely her behavior could be attributed to exhaustion. But no matter how much he tried to push the feeling aside, it refused to let go. Before dawn, unable to rest, George quietly slipped out of bed, careful not to disturb Nicole. He needed answers. In the pale light of the garage, he stood in front of Nicole's SUV, his heart pounding in his chest. What if something was wrong with her car? 2. His hands trembled slightly as he climbed into the driver's seat, gripping the wheel. He thought about starting the engine but froze, fear tightening in his throat. Instead, he opened the glove compartment, hoping for some distraction or maybe even some reassurance. Amid the usual clutter of receipts and random odds and ends, something caught his eye, a thick envelope. He pulled it out and opened it. Inside were the pristine documents of a family life insurance policy. His breath hitched. The policy was recent, dated just 2 weeks ago, and specifically listed George as the insured in the event of his death. His mind reeled. Nicole had never mentioned this. They always shared financial decisions, so why had she kept this from him? George's pulse quickened as he snapped a photo of the documents and carefully slid them back into place. Sitting there in the eerie stillness of the garage, he was overwhelmed by what he had just discovered. First, the brakes. Now this. The life insurance policy felt too coincidental to ignore. It was like a dark thread was slowly unraveling in his life, pulling him toward a conclusion he was desperate to avoid. But before diving into the next step, George knew he had to steady himself. Just as he was about to climb out of the car, the garage door creaked, making him freeze. He turned sharply to see Nicole standing there in her robe, loosely tied at the waist, her hair tousled from sleep. Her face was a mix of sleepiness and quiet curiosity. "George," she said, her voice thick with drowsiness. "What are you doing out here?" George forced a smile, trying to mask the tension coiling in his body. "I was thinking about taking your car today," he said, keeping his tone light. "But then I realized you might need it. I'll just grab a taxi instead." Nicole's eyes narrowed just a little, her gaze flicking over him with a trace of suspicion. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice carrying an undertone that George couldn't quite place. "Of course," he replied, keeping it casual. "You never know when you'll need to run an errand. Wouldn't want you stuck without a car." She paused, her eyes lingering on him for a beat longer than usual. Finally, she nodded. "Okay, let me know if you need anything." George walked past her, offering a warm smile that felt like a mask. But inside, his mind was racing. Nicole's reaction, though subtle, had only deepened his unease. There was something off about her. She wasn't overtly suspicious, but the way she was looking at him, the way she carried herself, it didn't sit right. The taxi ride to his office was uneventful, but the weight of unease pressed in on him, making the space around him feel suffocating. By the time he arrived at his private office, his hands were shaking. He locked the door behind him and sank into his chair, burying his face in his hands. Is this really happening? He wondered, pulling out his phone to stare at the picture of the insurance documents. The thought of going to the police flashed through his mind, but he quickly dismissed it. Without solid proof, making an accusation could destroy everything. If he was wrong, if he misunderstood, it would tear his family apart. Instead, he turned to the internet, searching for private investigators. He needed someone discreet, reliable, and thorough. After combing through reviews for what felt like hours, he found Harry Dutton, a seasoned investigator known for cracking even the toughest cases. 2 hours later, George found himself sitting across from Harry in a modest office on the outskirts of town. The man exuded an air of quiet competence, his sharp eyes assessing everything with practiced ease. "Mr. Barman," Harry said, leaning back in his chair, "what can I do for you?" George hesitated, his eyes scanning the room as if the walls themselves might be listening. He took a deep breath, then recounted everything. The brake failure, the suspicious insurance policy, Nicole's strange behavior. His voice faltered slightly as he finished. "I don't want to jump to conclusions," he admitted, his hands clenched tightly. "But something just doesn't feel right. I need to understand what's going on." Harry rubbed his hands together thoughtfully, his gaze unwavering. "Well, George, it seems like you're facing quite a mess." He paused, studying George closely. "Tell me more about your family." George hesitated for a moment, but then he spoke. He described Nicole. how they'd been married for more than 15 years, the life they had carefully built together, and how much he still loved her. He spoke with pride about Clara, their brilliant daughter who was about to head off to college, and the surprise of their second child on the way. He even mentioned his business success, how he had worked tirelessly to provide for them all. Finally, he spoke of Nicole's sister, Louise. When he finished, Harry sat back, absorbing the information in silence. Then he leaned forward, his expression turning serious. "On the surface, it all sounds perfect, George," he said slowly, his lips tight. "But setups like these, they could point to something darker." The words hit George like a punch to the gut. Harry raised a calming hand. "It's too early to say for sure, but we have to consider all possibilities. So, I need to ask, are there any hidden conflicts, secrets, or past issues you might have missed?" George shifted in his chair, racking his brain. Then, suddenly, a memory surfaced, one he hadn't thought of in years. "Louise," he murmured, almost to himself. "Maybe." "Go on," Harry urged, leaning in. 15 years ago, I started my business with Louise's husband, Albert," George began, his voice low. "First, everything was great. We worked well together. But then, about a year in, I found out he was embezzling money, committing fraud. If I hadn't caught him, it would have ruined everything. I reported him, and he ended up in prison. 6 months later, he died there. A heart attack." Harry's face darkened, but he remained silent, letting George continue. "After that, things with Louise were complicated," George went on. "I felt guilty, so I helped her financially, made sure she was okay. But she always blamed me for Albert's death, said the stress from prison killed him. Over time, though, it seemed like she forgave me. She even moved in with us from time to help Nicole when I was tied up with work." George's voice trailed off as he shook his head. "But maybe she never really forgave me." Harry steepled his fingers, his gaze hard. "Now that's an angle we can't ignore," he said grimly. "If we're looking for motives, Louise has a pretty big one. But here's the unsettling part. What if your wife is involved?" George's stomach churned. "Nicole? No, she wouldn't." His voice faltered, uncertainty creeping in like a shadow. Harry tapped his pen thoughtfully against the desk. "There's a possibility we can't dismiss. But if your marriage is as solid as you say, what reason would she have?" "I don't know," George admitted, his voice barely audible. Harry studied him carefully before asking the next question. "Is it possible Nicole has a lover?" The words hit George like a slap. He recoiled, his face flushing with disbelief. "No, she's kind, honest. She would never." But even as he spoke, doubt wormed its way into his mind. Could he really be so sure anymore? "I don't think so," he added, his words trailing off weakly. "But I don't know." Harry leaned back in his chair, his eyes sharp. "Then we need to rule it out or confirm it. Here's my plan. First, I recommend a DNA test with Clara, just to be certain." George's heart dropped. "What? Clara is my daughter." "I know she is." "Maybe she is," Harry said, his voice even. "But maybe she isn't. We need to eliminate every possibility." George's fists clenched, but he didn't argue. "Second," Harry continued, "I suggest we wiretap your house, discreetly. No one will know." After a long pause, George reluctantly nodded. "Okay." The weight of it all was suffocating. Each new discovery seemed to drag him deeper into a nightmare he couldn't escape. Harry's voice dropped, taking on a grave tone. "And one more thing, George," he said. "For now, it might be wise for you to leave town. Take a business trip, or just come up with some excuse to be away for a while. Cases like this can escalate quickly. I once worked with a man whose wife had been poisoning him for months, nearly killing him. By the time we uncovered the truth, he was blind and barely alive." The room felt colder with each word. George shifted uncomfortably, his pulse racing as cold sweat began to form on his brow. Harry's eyes locked onto his, intense and unwavering. "This is just the beginning, George. Stay alert. Be ready for anything." The following morning, George woke with a sense of determination that cut through the fog of uncertainty clouding his mind. His conversation with Harry still lingered, unsettling him, but he knew he couldn't afford to let fear take over. Every move mattered now. He had to keep up the appearance of normalcy while quietly gathering information and staying under the radar. Over breakfast, George decided to test the waters. "How about a family outing today?" he suggested casually, spreading jam on his toast. "Maybe we could hit a water park and then grab dinner at a nice place afterward." Nicole looked up, raising an eyebrow. "A water park? That's not really like you." "Exactly," George replied with a playful grin. "It's been way too long since we all did something fun together. We've all been so caught up in our routines, and this could be a nice break." Clara, distracted by her phone, perked up. "A water park sounds awesome." Louise, sitting quietly in the corner of the table, glanced up but didn't say anything. Her skeptical look didn't escape George's notice, but she kept her silence. As the family headed out for their outing, the house stood empty, a perfect opportunity. Shortly after they left, Harry and his team arrived in an unmarked van. They worked quickly and quietly, installing wiretaps and hidden cameras in all the right spots: the kitchen, the living room, even the master bedroom. Their efficiency was almost frightening, leaving no trace of their presence. Meanwhile, George did his best to seem relaxed at the water park. He laughed, joked, and even joined Clara on a few of the slides. Nicole appeared to ease up as the day wore on, her earlier tension slowly dissolving. Louise, however, remained distant, her sharp gaze never far from George, constantly assessing him. At dinner, in a cozy Italian restaurant, George casually brought up his business trip. Cutting into his steak, he said, "I wanted to let you know, I've got a major project coming up at work. It's critical, and I'll have to be out of town for a couple of weeks." The change in Nicole's demeanor was immediate. Her smile faltered, and her tone turned cold. "You're leaving again?" she asked, her voice tinged with frustration. "George, you're always so busy with work. I'm pregnant, and Clara's getting ready to leave for college. Don't you think we need you here?" Before George could respond, Louise chimed in, her voice calm but loaded with subtle authority. "Nicole, sometimes work takes priority. George's the one providing for us all. If this project is that important, we should support him." Nicole shot Louise a sharp look, her jaw tightening, but she quickly forced a smile. "You're right," she said, though her words were tight with restraint. "I overreacted." George noticed the tension between them. Nicole's reaction was controlled, but Louise's intervention seemed to shut her down, like a quiet warning. It didn't sit right with him. Back home that evening, George's nerves were on edge. The fear gnawing at him wouldn't let go. When Nicole offered him tea, he turned it down with a polite smile, opting to make his own chamomile tea instead. "Are you okay?" Nicole asked, watching him intently as he stirred his tea, her eyes sharp with suspicion. George smiled, trying to mask the unease that was slowly suffocating him. "I'm fine," he reassured her, trying to sound casual. "Just trying to take some of the burden off you. You've got enough on your plate." Nicole studied him for a long moment, her gaze lingering with an unreadable expression. Then, without a word, she left the room. A few days later, George packed a small suitcase, carefully said his goodbyes, and gave Clara an unusually long hug. His heart clenched as he thought about the DNA test, the truth hanging over him like a storm cloud. With a kiss on Nicole's cheek, he walked out the door without a second glance. His hotel room several towns away was basic and unremarkable, the perfect place to wait for updates from Harry and the DNA lab. But George couldn't just sit there. Following Harry's advice, he dove into their finances, searching for any discrepancies or signs of trouble. First, everything seemed normal. But then he found something: large, unexplained withdrawals from Nicole's account, all occurring around the same time the life insurance policy was issued. "Maybe it's for the policy," George muttered to himself, trying to rationalize it. But the numbers didn't add up. The total amount Nicole had withdrawn was far greater than what the policy could have cost. His stomach tightened. Where's the rest of the money going? Frustrated, George leaned back in the worn chair, staring up at the cracked ceiling of the hotel room. "Forget it," he muttered under his breath. "I'll wait for Harry's report and the DNA results. One thing at a time." The call came that afternoon. George sat on the edge of the bed, his phone clenched tightly in his hand. The DNA lab's number flashed on the screen, and for a moment he hesitated before answering. "Mr. Barman," the voice on the other end said, its tone flat and clinical. "We've completed the testing. The results are conclusive. The DNA samples you provided do not match. Clara is not your biological daughter." The words hit George like a sledgehammer. His chest tightened, and the room seemed to close in around him. The life he had built, the family he'd fought for, unraveled in an instant. Hands shaking, George dialed Harry's number. The phone rang only once before the detective answered. "George." Harry's voice was sharp, immediately sensing something was wrong. "What happened?" "She's not mine," George choked out, his voice cracking. "Clara, she's not my daughter." Harry exhaled sharply, a sound that was part sympathy, part grim understanding. "I feared that might be the case," he said quietly. "Listen, George, I know this is hard, but you need to stay focused. This is the moment when people start to crack, and that's when they make mistakes." George barely registered Harry's words. The storm inside his head was deafening. His entire life, his marriage, his family was unraveling one horrifying revelation at a time. "Do you have anything concrete yet?" George asked, his voice rough with desperation. "I do," Harry replied, his tone measured and calm. "But I need more time to connect the dots. There's a bigger picture emerging, but it's not clear yet. In the meantime, you need to act, and fast." "Act? What do you mean?" George's voice trembled with the weight of everything he had learned, everything he had yet to uncover. "First, you need a lawyer," Harry said firmly. "A good one, and financial consultants who can protect your assets. File for divorce before Nicole does. If you don't, they might move first and take everything." "Why the rush?" George asked, still trying to process the avalanche of information Harry had just delivered. Harry paused, his voice lowering with gravity. "Two reasons. One, filing first puts them on the defensive. When people panic, they make mistakes, and I'll have a better chance of gathering evidence. Two, if Nicole files first, she could freeze your accounts or stake a claim on your assets. Don't give them that opportunity." Though overwhelmed, George couldn't deny the cold logic of Harry's words. "All right," he said at last, his voice heavy with a resigned sense of duty. "I'll handle it in the next 10 days. For the next few days, George worked relentlessly, pouring all his energy into securing his position. He hired one of the best divorce lawyers in the city and assembled a team of financial consultants who specialized in protecting assets during contentious divorces. Together, they crafted a strategy to safeguard George's wealth and prepare him for the inevitable fallout. The first step was selling his stake in the business. He approached his most trusted partners, people who had been by his side throughout his career, and quietly sold them his shares. The funds were transferred into accounts that Nicole and Louise couldn't access. Next, under the guidance of his consultants, George moved the money into a series of carefully constructed trusts and offshore accounts. The system was designed like a labyrinth, complicated and secure, ensuring that his assets would be out of their reach. The final step was perhaps the most difficult: cutting Nicole off financially. He froze all their joint accounts, severing the last thread of control she had over his finances. It felt cold, calculating, like a betrayal, but it was necessary. When the last safeguard was in place, George sat back in his chair, mentally and physically drained. He had done everything he could to protect himself. The next morning, George found himself holding his phone, unsure whether to call Nicole. He hadn't spoken to her directly since he'd left for his business trip, and he knew that the frozen accounts would soon raise questions. The confrontation was inevitable. He braced himself for it. The phone buzzed in his hand, snapping him from his thoughts. It was Nicole. George hesitated for a long moment before answering. "Hello, George." Nicole's voice was carefully neutral. "How are you?" Is everything going well with work? It's fine, George said, keeping his voice even, despite the knot in his stomach. Everything's fine. That's good, Nicole responded quickly, but there was an underlying tension in her voice. Listen, I noticed the bank account is frozen. Did you block it? Or is there some sort of issue? We have Clara's college deposit due soon. George's chest tightened, but he didn't flinch. He took a slow breath, steadying himself. Nicole, Clara's not my daughter, he said, the words coming out colder than he intended. So pay for it yourself. And by the way, a courier will be delivering the divorce papers today. There was a sharp inhale on the other end of the line. What? George, what are you talking about? This doesn't make sense. Are you okay? George's grip tightened on the phone, the device feeling almost like a lifeline, but also a barrier between him and the woman he thought he knew. I'm fine, he replied flatly. And I'm sorry, but we'll talk in court. There'll be plenty to discuss then. Before Nicole could respond, George ended the call abruptly. The silence that followed felt deafening, like the weight of everything collapsing on top of him. For a moment, he allowed himself to sink into that silence. Then, without warning, his composure cracked. He buried his face in his hands and wept. 15 years of marriage, a daughter he had raised as his own. Everything was falling apart. Worse yet, he still didn't know the full truth. What other secrets were Nicole and Louise hiding? What had he missed all these years? The phone buzzed again, and again. George didn't pick up. He couldn't bear to hear Nicole's fury or her desperate pleas. But when the third call came, he glanced at the screen, seeing Clara's name. Wiping his eyes, George answered. Hello, Dad. Clara's voice was frantic. What's going on? Mom's freaking out and I don't understand anything. She says the accounts are blocked. I need money for my deposit. What's happening? George's throat tightened, and a wave of guilt washed over him, but he fought to sound calm. Clara, something has come up. Your college plans might have to wait a little while. What? Clara's voice cracked, panic rising. Dad, I can't wait. This is my future. Please, just tell me what's going on. George pinched the bridge of his nose, trying to summon any shred of strength left in him. Clara, calm down. Your mother and I need to work through some things. I promise if you stay patient, everything will be okay. We'll talk soon. All right? But, Clara's voice faltered, unsure. Please, Clara, George interrupted gently but firmly. Trust me. There was a long pause. Finally, in a small, broken voice, Clara replied, Okay, Dad. When the call ended, George set the phone down with a deep sigh and stared at the ceiling. Guilt and sorrow churned inside him, twisting his insides. No matter what happened with Nicole and Louise, Clara would always be his daughter in his heart. He had raised her, loved her. She was his in every way that mattered. But how much more could he endure before this nightmare reached its end? That night, George barely slept. The whiskey burned his throat as he poured glass after glass, chasing a reprieve from the relentless ache in his chest. His sobs were raw and guttural, the kind of pain he hadn't allowed himself to feel since childhood. By dawn, the bottle was empty, and George lay hollow and exhausted, staring blankly at the ceiling. His phone buzzed, jolting him from his stupor. It was Harry. George, Harry said briskly. We've hit a turning point. The divorce news shook them. It's working. We need to meet today, and bring your lawyer. Though his head pounded and his body felt drained, George knew he couldn't stop now. He agreed, his voice hoarse but resolute. When George arrived at the office for their meeting, his lawyer was already seated, sifting through a stack of documents with a grim expression. Moments later, Harry entered, carrying a large briefcase. His face was set with the gravity of someone about to reveal something explosive. All right, Harry began, placing the briefcase on the table. Here's what I've uncovered. He opened it and began laying out the evidence. Photographs, video recordings, and transcripts of intercepted conversations. The sheer volume of material was overwhelming, and George leaned forward, his breath catching as he absorbed the horrifying narrative they painted. Nicole and Louise appeared in numerous photos and videos, speaking in hushed tones, making phone calls, and meeting clandestinely. Then came the images of Nicole with another man, Daniel. Their interactions were unmistakably personal. George's chest tightened as he stared at one photo of Daniel stroking Nicole's hair, their faces close. It was undeniable. "This is Daniel," Harry explained, his voice steady. "Nicole's lover." George barely heard the words, his heartbeat roaring in his ears. His lawyer muttered a curse under his breath, shaking his head at the damning evidence. "And this," Harry said, pulling out an audio file, "is the most incriminating piece." He pressed play. The voices of Nicole and Louise filled the room, cold and calculated. Their words confirmed everything George had feared, and more. George's vision blurred as his chest constricted painfully. His lawyer reached out, gripping his shoulder. "George," Harry said urgently, leaning closer. "Are you okay?" George tried to speak, but his voice failed him. The room spun, and his breathing grew ragged. A crushing pain gripped his chest as he slumped forward. "Call a doctor," his lawyer shouted. A doctor arrived quickly, administering an injection to stabilize George. "Your heart's under too much strain," the doctor warned. "Stress like this can be dangerous. You need a full cardiac evaluation immediately." George nodded weakly, trembling as he leaned back in his chair. His face was pale, and his breaths came in shallow gasps. "George," Harry said softly after a moment, his tone more measured, "I know this is a lot to process, but the evidence is overwhelming. We can take this to court, not just for the divorce but for a criminal case. Are you ready?" George didn't trust himself to speak. He simply nodded, his eyes filled with a quiet, determined fury. 5 days later, the courtroom was packed. George sat beside his lawyer, his face calm but hollow. Across the room, Nicole sat flanked by Louise and her legal team. She looked confident, her hand resting on her pregnant belly. A subtle, calculated gesture. Nicole's lawyers began their arguments, painting George as a vindictive man who had plotted the divorce to freeze her out of their shared assets. They accused him of being manipulative, even unfaithful. They dismissed the DNA test as inconclusive and demanded an independent study. Their strategy was clear: prolong the proceedings, muddy the waters, and buy time. George's lawyer fought back, dismantling their claims piece by piece. The courtroom became a battleground, each side relentlessly pushing their narrative. Nicole's pregnancy, however, proved to be a potent weapon, and her lawyers wielded it expertly to garner sympathy. At a crucial moment, George exchanged a glance with his lawyer and gave a subtle nod. It was time. George's lawyer stood, his voice calm but commanding. "Your Honor, we have new evidence to present. This material is not only relevant to this case, but it also suggests grounds for a criminal investigation." He handed a thick folder to the judge. "I must warn you," he added gravely, "this evidence may change the scope of these proceedings." The courtroom fell silent as the judge accepted the folder, his brow furrowing as he scanned the contents. His expression darkened as he read. "We'll take a 30-minute recess," the judge announced, his voice heavy with authority. "I need time to review this material." In his chambers, the judge and 2 legal advisors pored over the folder. Each page painted a darker picture than the last. The first section contained photographic evidence. Daniel, caught on a street surveillance camera late at night, crouching near George's car. The images showed him tampering with the brake system, a wrench in one hand and another unidentifiable tool in the other. His actions were deliberate, methodical, and left no doubt that this was a premeditated act. Next came transcripts of recorded conversations between Nicole and Louise, captured after the brake tampering attempt failed. The words revealed cracks in their conspiracy, Nicole's mounting anxiety clashing with Louise's cold determination. "This should have worked," Nicole's voice quavered. "Maybe we shouldn't have done this. Maybe we should have just gone for a divorce." "Are you serious right now?" Louise snapped. "If you just divorce him, George will dig into everything. He'll find out about Daniel. Then where will you be?" No alimony. No assets. He'll bury you in court, Nicole. You'll have nothing. But what about Daniel? Nicole asked, fear lacing her words. If he gets caught, this could ruin everything. Daniel's careful, Louise replied coldly. He knows the stakes. And don't forget, if George dies, we get the insurance payout. His inheritance, his assets, everything. You, me, and Daniel will be set for life. A long pause followed, broken only by Nicole's shallow breathing. Fine, she finally said, her voice trembling. But I'm scared, Louise. This is dangerous. Dangerous. Louise laughed humorlessly. You'll be thanking me when it's over. The judge set down the file. He looked up, his face pale, clearly shaken by the content. George sat still, his body numb. He had feared this day, but now that the truth was in the open, the weight of it all pressed down harder than ever. What would Nicole say now? Would she deny it all, try to manipulate her way out? And what about Louise? How far had their plan gone? The clock on the wall ticked slowly, but each passing second felt like an eternity. The folder also contained videos of Nicole and Daniel. One particularly damning clip showed Daniel tenderly stroking Nicole's pregnant belly, whispering to her. Other documents revealed that Daniel was financially unstable, providing him with a clear motive to conspire with Nicole against George. The courtroom was silent as the judge returned from recess, his expression grim. He looked directly at Nicole's legal team, his voice steady but weighted with authority. This court has reviewed the new evidence, he said. It is sufficient to warrant a criminal investigation. These proceedings will not only address the divorce, but also explore potential charges of conspiracy. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Nicole's confident demeanor faltered, her hand dropping from her belly. Louise's icy composure cracked as she shifted uncomfortably in her seat. George sat motionless, his face unreadable. But inside, a flicker of vindication burned. The truth was finally beginning to surface. The judge's expression was severe. His lips pressed into a thin line as he shuffled the documents before him. Finally, he looked up, his voice resonating through the silent courtroom. I have reviewed the materials submitted by the petitioner's counsel. He began, his tone grave. This evidence is deeply troubling. It appears that we are dealing with not only a contentious divorce but also allegations of premeditated criminal activity, including conspiracy to commit murder. A wave of gasps rippled through the courtroom. Nicole's face drained of color, her hands trembling. Beside her, Louise's eyes narrowed, but she kept her composure, her jaw set like stone. The judge continued, given the severity of these allegations and the compelling nature of the evidence, I am compelled to take immediate action. This court will notify law enforcement to conduct a full investigation. Until that investigation is complete, all discussions regarding asset division and custody arrangements are suspended. The weight of the judge's words settled over the room like a suffocating cloud. The gavel came down with a sharp, decisive thud. This hearing is adjourned until further notice. Court officers, remain in the building to assist the police. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as the gravity of the revelations sank in. For Nicole, Louise, and Daniel, the walls were closing in fast. Within days, the police launched a formal investigation, and the fallout was swift and unforgiving. Nicole, Louise, and Daniel were taken into custody. Harry's meticulous work had left no doubt. The brake tampering, the secret insurance policy, the recorded conversations. It all painted a damning picture. For the conspirators, this was the end. They were charged with conspiracy. The carefully curated lives they had built crumbled under the weight of their own actions. George, though vindicated, felt no joy, only the bitter taste of loss. The nightmare had exposed the kind of truths he had never imagined and destroyed relationships he had thought were unshakable. One afternoon, George sat across from Nicole in the sterile visiting room of the county jail. She looked worn and fragile, her once vibrant energy replaced by exhaustion and regret. George, she began, her voice trembling. I don't even know where to start. George's expression was cold, his arms crossed. Then don't, he said flatly. Just say what you need to say. Tears welled in Nicole's eyes as she wiped her face, her voice breaking. I'm sorry. I never wanted it to come to this. I loved Daniel. He was my first love, my everything. But life, it separated us. Then you came along. You were a good man, George. A great provider. You were kind, stable. But you were never him. Daniel was my hero. George clenched his jaw, his eyes unflinching. So I was a placeholder? A paycheck? The man you could tolerate while plotting to kill me? Nicole shook her head, breaking into sobs. No, it wasn't supposed to go that far. I made mistakes, terrible mistakes. I let Louise convince me. I was scared, George. I thought you'd leave me with nothing. George's gaze remained fixed on her, his silence cutting deeper than words. Nicole sniffled, trying to compose herself. Please, George, she whispered. Promise me you'll take care of Clara. She's innocent in all this. George's voice was distant, devoid of warmth. I'll take care of Clara because she's my daughter in every way that matters. But you, Nicole, you're nothing to me now. You destroyed everything. Nicole lowered her head, defeated. I understand, she murmured. And I'm sorry. George's next visit was with Louise. Unlike Nicole, she showed no sign of remorse. Sitting in her cell, her chin held high, she met George's gaze with unfiltered hatred. I suppose you're here to gloat, she sneered. No, George replied evenly. I'm here to understand. Why, Louise? Why do this? Louise laughed bitterly. Understand? You think you're the victim here? You ruined my life, George. You sent Albert to prison, and he died because of you. He was a good man until you destroyed him. George shook his head slowly. Albert was a fraud, Louise. He embezzled from the business and betrayed everyone. He ruined himself. Lies. Louise spat. You could have saved him, but you didn't. You cared more about your precious company than about people. George sighed, his exhaustion evident. I understand your anger, but you've twisted the truth to suit your hatred. Albert made his choices. He betrayed me, and he betrayed you. You're a monster, George, Louise said venomously. I wanted to make you pay, but now you're walking free while we rot in here. George rose to leave, his face devoid of emotion. I won't pity you. You made your choices, just like Albert. Sitting down with Clara was the hardest. Her red, swollen eyes were filled with confusion and anger. How could you, Dad? She demanded, her voice trembling. Mom's in prison. Louise's in prison. Everything's ruined. Clara, George said softly, you know why they tried to harm me. I didn't want this, but I couldn't ignore the truth. They're my family, she screamed. And you destroyed us. George's heart broke at her words. Clara, I know this is painful, but they made their own decisions. I had to protect myself. You're lying, Clara cried, tears streaming down her face. You could have fixed this. You could have done something. I hate you. Her words pierced George like a dagger. He sat quietly, letting her vent her pain. When her sobs subsided, he spoke gently. I'm sorry you feel that way, but I won't let you suffer because of this. I've set up an account for you enough to cover college and your living expenses. You'll be okay, Clara. No matter what, I want the best for you. Clara didn't respond, her sobs filling the room. George left quietly, his heart heavy. He knew she was hurting, and though her anger stung, he couldn't blame her. In court, the evidence was overwhelming. Nicole, Louise, and Daniel were convicted of conspiracy and attempted. Nicole wept openly as the verdict was read, while Louise remained cold and unrepentant. Daniel sat silently, his head bowed in defeat. George had won, but it felt hollow. The life he had fought so hard to protect was gone, replaced by shattered memories and fractured relationships. Clara, consumed by anger and pain, cut all contact, even refusing the money George had set aside for her. Still, George left the account untouched, hoping that one day she might forgive him. For now, he resolved to rebuild his life quietly, stepping away from Clara's world but leaving the door open should she ever choose to return.